Before we start, I think I'm sure the distinguished panelists will join me in applauding, even though silently, the organizers, the Canada Interfaith Conversation, the Multi-Faith Center. Not well known to many in this room that on Canada Day, July the 1st, these premises of the hall upstairs turns into a mosque, a synagogue, a church, a temple, and a place of worship in the indigenous communities of this adopted land of ours, from 9 a.m. to about noon. And a comment was made about us being, in that context, and that during this 4 hours or 3 hours, this will be the 5th anniversary if we hold it this year, where we are, those who attend, are not simply listening to talk to lectures like I'm speaking right now, but sharing, participating in these sacred ceremonies of faiths other than our own. And nothing can be closer to the Canadian identity. And Reverend Leslie Meze, who is sitting in front of me, a comment was made that we share not only in the sacred ceremonies of others, but also we strengthen our own. Reverend Leslie Meze, Holocaust survivor, ordained Chirag in the Sufi tradition, a practicing yogi, and all hats he wears with such humility and grace. So coming back to our theme of this morning, and we will make a slight change in the sense we were given 1 hour, but I think we'll take only 50 minutes because we are running late. 45 to 50 minutes, we will take that. But coming back to our many discourses, conferences have been taking place in recent times to find ways in which religions can guide humanity in ways that will be constructive. But the historians will also suggest that these grounds have been established for thousands of years. These grounds have been established for thousands of years by ordinary common people like you and I, if not you, certainly me. And theologians, philosophers, saints, etc. And I was going to recite numerous examples of something that presented at the World Peace Summit of the United Nations 2000, of about 500 simple, elementary commonalities, common grounds that Reverend Leslie Meze and we worked at it also in 2000. We published in 17 languages, but we don't have the time. Simple, ordinary things that are common grounds for different faith traditions to come together and bring about into fruition that which is otherwise denied by the economic and political powers of the day. So without further ado, that resonates, and I will not be able to won't have the time to go through the list, but perhaps another time. But without further ado, this resonates actually with the distinguished panelists, so let me just go ahead and start the introduction of the panelists. We will spend, or they will spend, about 10 to 12 to 13, 14 minutes. We may not have time, given our time constraint, we may not have time to have questions from the audiences, but we will have enough time for interaction between the panelists after they're given these presentations. So on my immediate left, Dr. Kofi Hope is a change maker. He's a Rhodes Scholar and has a doctorate in politics from Oxford University. Currently, he's Senior Policy Advisor at the Wellesley Institute, a strategic consultant to the Vice President, HR, Human Resources, Equity at the University of Toronto, and the Bousfield Visiting Scholar of U of T School of Urban Planning. In 2017, he was the winner of the Jane Jacobs Prize, and in 2018, he was named a Rising Star by Toronto Life in their Power List. Dr. Hope is also the founder and former Executive Director of CEE, Center for Young Black Professionals. In 2005, he founded the Black Youth Coalition Against Violence, which became a leading voice for advocating for real solutions to gun violence in Toronto, and led him being named one of the top 10 people to watch in Toronto in 2016 by the Toronto Star. I'm humbled to be in your presence. We will introduce the other speakers as the time comes. Dr. Kofi Hope.
All right. So good morning. It's great to be here today sharing with you all. What does it mean to be human? How do we rethink identity to protect human dignity, bring communities together, and stay relevant in the 21st century? Those are easy questions to start the day with, right? Well, that's what the challenge was placed to us on this panel today, and I'll do my best to provide a response. For my remarks today, I'm going to talk about what I see to be the dominant form of identity today in our modern society, a market-based form of individualism. Then I'll speak about the need for a new, more collective conception of human identity. And I'll argue that our faith traditions have a key role in helping to do this, but that these conceptions won't come from academic discussions like this, but from collective actions we launch together to build a more socially just world. So, let me start with where we are. To me, talking about human identity in Western society today is all about individualism. We live in a society where free market values have become our core values, where everything, including human beings, become to some extent commodities to be measured, bought, sold, and exchanged. Where in conversations, we use words that define us not as humans, not as citizens, but as actors in the market. Clients, consumers, taxpayers. These are the kind of labels we use for ourselves. You know, I used to run a nonprofit organization in the city. It focused on working with young men and women who self-identified as Black, were facing major barriers to employment. And one of the things I hated was the tendency in the nonprofit sector to talk about the young people we served as clients all the time. And all the other EDs, we'd meet, our clients are this. And I said to my team, these are not our clients. We're not in a market relationship with these young people. We're here to serve them. If anything, we're trying to build a community, and if we have to have a label for them, it's they are members of our organization. But most organizations use this label of client because that's what's most familiar. And so often now, our relationship to other human beings are defined by our economic relationships, where life really is seen as it's about a person standing on their own in the market. They are, fighting in a kind of dog-eat-dog world to get their piece of the Canadian dream. And we have this understanding of humans as distinct individuals, not living in the world, but living in an economy. And within this economy, one value stands out, and that value is winning. Chris Hedges, in his brilliant book, Empire of Illusions, talks in detail about how winning is seen as being at the core of our modern society. Whether you win by being able to put a tiny ball in a little hole really well, or whether you win by being able to eat the most hot dogs in a televised competition, or through getting the most streams or sales of albums, or by making the most money selling people bad mortgages, we have a collective moral compass now that says the best human beings, those with the most value, are the winners. For an easy example, let's look south of the border. We have a US president whose entire philosophy is based on the fact that, hey, I won in the world of business, I won in the world of elections, I'm a winner, I'm gonna make you winners, and that thus means everything I do is moral and ethical, and my winning is the basis for moving forward. And when he was challenged, I remember watching him in the early days of his presidency, and people would challenge him on ideas, and what would his response be? I just won a historic victory, the biggest victory ever. Winning itself gave the moral kind of license to do what he pleased. And I thought just to kind of, it's also funny, but just to kind of bring this home, I'm going to quote from US President Donald Trump, one of his famous quotes at a recent election rally. Actually, it's 2 years ago, so not so recent. But here's what he said, and I quote, "You're going to win so much, you may even get tired of winning. And you'll say, please, please, we can't take it anymore. It's too much winning. You'll have to win more. We're going to win more. You'll say, Mr. President, we can't take it anymore. And I'll say, no, it's not enough. We've got to keep on winning. We're going to win so much." And he ended it saying, "I love you all." On this premise, I'm the winner. The US hasn't been winning enough. I will make us winners again. He won an election for the most powerful country in the world. And this obsession with winners, by extension, has all of us being obsessed with winning and showing the world that we've won in the game of life. And I see that as peak individualism. And it doesn't even seem to matter what is being won, just that in life you are on the side of the winners and not the losers. Good life is defined by this triumph of the individual over competition, or the triumph of an individual nation over all others. And so it's no surprise that in a world so focused on individual success, that most people report being fearful and anxious. Because the world is tough, and deep down, we don't all believe that we can all win all the time. And if it's just you and your family in this dog-eat-dog world, where community cannot be trusted to help you out, then life seems quite worrisome. And we know from exhaustive research by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett that the more unequal your society is, the more prone people are to social comparison with others, to trying to catch up with others through conspicuous consumption, the more susceptible we are to advertising, and overall, the more anxious we feel. So we're stuck in this kind of horrible feedback loop. Our society is getting more unequal. We all feel more uncomfortable that we aren't keeping up and catching up with the Joneses. So there's an urge to retreat back into even more individualism, to say, well, forget solving problems collectively. Just give me my tax money back, and I'll do the best I can so that me and my family can survive. And of course, the inequity then gets worse, and the same feelings continue. And it's such a state that makes us susceptible to populist leaders who ride into town saying, the game is rigged, just like you think. All these elites are winning while you lose. But with me, you'll start winning again. But to me, there's a counter-narrative. But it starts with a new form of identity that we're all searching for and that this panel is about. It lies in a more collective understanding of the human experience and human identity. And for me, I relate to this idea through the Southern African philosophy of Ubuntu. This idea that not as Descartes and Western philosophy says, I think, therefore I am, but Ubuntu says, I am because we are. That human identity, that being human is a collective experience. Being human is defined by our interconnection and our interdependency with others. And I believe the more this form of human identity can take root in our popular consciousness, the better off we will be as a society. But here is a truth that in some circles would be controversial, probably not so much in this room. And that's the truth that so many of our more collective understandings of being human are rooted in our spiritual traditions. And so I believe in order to develop new conceptions and make them land, we need to engage with and pull on the deep reservoirs of wisdom and knowledge in our faith traditions. For example, here's one truth. Our entire framework for thinking about human rights, a core part of how we think about being human today, is rooted in spirituality. Now, some people may have read the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. If you haven't, it's a good book. He's a very smart man, good writer. I don't always agree with his worldviews, but he's certainly provocative. And he makes a provocative claim in the book around human rights. And he notes, that the reality is human rights are not founded in science or biology. He talks about and lays out how they have a Judeo-Christian intellectual foundation in the Western world. And, they come from this idea that each individual person is not just a flesh sack holding DNA out in the world trying to pass on that DNA to as many more flesh sacks as possible, but that actually we as Homo sapiens have a soul, a spiritual essence that connects us to the divine, that is a thing of beauty, and that this divine essence gives each human being an inherent dignity and self-worth. And Yuval notes in the book that this doesn't jive with much of contemporary science, and says, one day we need to think about a new conception of human rights, one that isn't based in spiritual traditions, but that's rooted in biology and in science. And to me, that's an incredibly scary proposition. That's not to say that there aren't traditions like secular humanism, which value human rights, but don't have a reference necessarily to a spiritual foundation. But in an age of science and skepticism, of hyper-materialism and market-based approaches to life, I worry how long our current ideas about human rights will survive. With advances in biotechnology and artificial intelligence, making us have to make some really tough choices pretty soon about how we want to develop as a society, how long before this science-based approach Harari speaks about starts to redefine how we think about human life, the value of human life, and the rights we have as individual human beings. And I worry this new approach, if it happens, will not be one that's based on the foundational equality of all people on this earth. So what to do? Well, I think in this age of disruption, the good side is people are really willing to challenge old paradigms. I saw something about the United States that was saying almost half of millennials in the US now say they'd be willing to give socialism a try. Something that even 10 years ago wouldn't have been possible. We're in a time where people are really looking for new ideas. And I believe that our diverse faith communities can have a critical role in bringing forward new conceptions of being human, because truly this is a spiritual conversation. Spirituality for me means grappling with the mysteries of life and trying to find and define meaning and purpose in our lives, in opposition to simply settling on a random and cold universe. And one of the reasons we really need faith traditions involved in this redefining is that they have the language that can help us create an understanding of human existence counter to simply this market-based approach. So another article I'll bring in. I was looking at the New York Times a few months ago, and they did this interesting study that looked at language and church attendance in America. And basically they found, as church attendance went down, when they tracked the appearance of words in newspapers and magazines and books, they found as church attendance had gone down, so had the appearance of more traditional, churchy words. There was less reference to divinity, to redemption, to the sacred in American culture. But they also found the same decline in words like duty, compassion, justice, forgiveness, and love. Words that may not seem inherently religious, but the fact is, for most folks, deep exploration of these terms tend to happen in faith-based settings, or they don't happen at all. I remember myself, I'd never thought about the difference between happiness and joy until I was in a church-based discussion and we were talking about that. Like, is it the same thing? What does it mean to truly be joyful? Or, what does it mean to have justice? What's the nature of love? These, for myself, were all conversations that only happened and happened meaningfully in spiritual contexts. So the advantage of people who follow a spiritual path is not that we have the answers to all of life's big questions, but at least we have the language to have the ability to hold the conversations about those questions. So if we want to start to grapple with defining a new form of human identity, I believe faith groups, spiritual people, religiously affiliated or not, need to take a leading role in these discussions. Not that these ideas must then lead to a new religious revivalism. The conceptions that are created can be offered freely and inclusively for others to take as they wish. But how do we do that? Well, I really believe in this one spiritual idea I learned as part of the United Church of Canada as a young adult. This idea, to know each other is to love each other. Maybe that's a tad romantic, but let's say at least to know each other gives us a chance to love each other. That empathy for a concept is hard and many times distorted. We build true empathy for individuals through relationships with them. And if we want to build a new conception of being human, and an identity that's more rooted in community and connection, we have to do this together in relationship. And talking is great, but these new ideas won't emerge from events like this, from us just sitting and discussing human nature, solidarity, and connection. Solidarity, connection, and community are built through joint action to heal our sick world. When Sikhs and Jews and Christians gather together in front of a mosque so that their Muslim brothers and sisters could pray safely after the New Zealand attacks, that's when we start creating new spaces where a new form of identity can emerge. In my PhD research, I looked at the anti-apartheid movement in Canada, which saw devoted Christians, devoted Marxists, Muslims, Jews, white, black, brown, Canadian, South African, old, young, all sorts of people from diverse backgrounds came together in a movement to fight for the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And in this space, they created new transnational identities and conceptions, a community that transcended their individual backgrounds and was built around a universal conception of human rights. Now, this movement wasn't without its bumps, without its fights, without its divisions, but community is that too. Community is messy, but it's through struggle and collective action in that very messiness that we start forging new forms of identity and connection. My take is that if you want to see a new form of identity that can counter the rampant individualism that is leading us to be afraid, divided, and fractured, we need to bring people together, especially people of faith, in joint action. And then we need to attach time for collecting the stories of these activities, of these movements, whether it's in art, whether it's in discussion, in writing. in the intellectual exercises that allow new emerging identities to crystallize and then easily be shared with others. And of course, it won't be easy. Intercultural work is hard. It takes time to build relationships. It takes time to build trust. But this is the work. So to sum up, I believe the new identities our world needs come through collective work by diverse people. And it must be work that is inclusive, but also reflective, where we talk about the values and ideas that drive it. I love interfaith work because it's led by values. So I see interfaith action as being a prime place for forging new types of human identity. But it needs to be grounded in a joint mission, whether it's a want to improve something, whether it's providing homes for the homeless, fixing the environment, or resisting racism. And we need reflective leadership, philosophers and storytellers, and could be part of this work to capture it and speak back the meaning that was created to the larger community. And then, of course, we need to share these stories with the world so that others can look to the ideas we've forged and be inspired. And in doing so, we may even rediscover the stories of our ancestors, who similarly came together in struggle to forge new ways of being human. Because friends, values live in stories. So I guess my answer to these questions is that a new form of human identity will be found in the stories we make together in facing the challenges of today and in rekindling the lost stories of work that has been done before. It's through this, I believe, we can create a space for a new paradigm that embraces hope, connection, and interdependency over individualism, division, and hate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hope. That was a brilliant expose on what the central theme of this conference is. And we will ask questions, I'm sure other panelists who's also here. But there's one thing that I sort of, I felt a little bit of a tinge, although you meant very well and you explained it beautifully, new identities. The example I just gave about this center becoming a mosque, a church, a synagogue, a temple, a gurdwara, etc., on the Canada Day, is to lose those identities as a Muslim, as a Hindu, as a Christian, and simply be human. We have too many identities, way, way far too many, and you articulate so well, identities that are forced upon us, these diabolical pressures on us to have different identities, but the focus should be also simply being human, just being. The next speaker, we will have time to elaborate on these in the next 2 days, not just the next hour or so, next 2 days. Ms. Nuzhat Jafri is the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, CCMW, where she leads initiatives focused on the equality, equity, and empowerment of Canadian Muslim women. She is active in interfaith outreach and served as the Canadian Communications Manager for the 2018 Parliament of the World's Religions. She's also the principal of Fair Practices Consulting, a management consulting firm specializing in equity, inclusion, diversity, human rights, and accessibility. Nuzhat was the first and the only executive director of the Office of the Fairness Commissioner, OFC, from 2007 to 2017. The OFC's mandate is to ensure that anyone applying for licensure to practice in a regulated profession in Ontario is treated fairly regardless of their academic qualifications. She has wide leadership experience in public, private, all this in one lifetime. I haven't reached 1/3 of the page. All this in one lifetime. No, I was going to say if you'd like to add some more. But no, we are privileged to have Nuzhat Jafri to present her thoughts with us on this theme of this conference.
So good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. So I'm going to probably take a different approach to the questions that were raised. And when I was thinking about this morning's panel, I said, okay, what am I going to talk about? Because those are very fundamental questions. Yes, we are all human. I am human. When we're rethinking identity, what are we talking about? So I'm going to begin my talk with a quote from Canadian author Lawrence Hill. Lawrence writes, "Canadians have a favorite pastime, and they don't even realize it. They like to ask, They absolutely love to ask, where are you from, if you don't look convincingly white. They want to know it, they need to know it. They must simply have that information. They just can't relax until they've pinpointed to their satisfaction your geographic and racial coordinates. They can go almost out of their minds with curiosity, as when driven by the need for food, water, or sex. But once they've finally managed to find out precisely where you were born, who your parents were, and what your racial makeup is, then man, do they feel the business of living. So this is an excerpt from Lawrence Hill's Blackberry Sweet Juice on being black and white in Canada. And the reason why I wanted to start with that is because I'm asked that question all the time. Where are you from? Well, I am human. No. Where are you really from? Toronto. No. Before that, Scarborough. No. Before that, oh, Thorncliffe Park. Nope, that's not it. Avenue Road and St. Clair. Nope, you're not there yet. Well, let me tell you, I was born in Karachi, Pakistan. And I've lived here in Canada since 1964. I came here as a child. And yes, I have lived in all of those places, and I am from all those places. But I got my beginning, parents, in India, in UP. And my parents were migrants during the partition from India to Pakistan in 1947. And then they created me in the 50s, in 1953 or 4. And then I arrived here. So I'm from a lot of different places. And it's who I am. And then they sort of want to know more about me because everybody's curious. I work for an organization called the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, and I've been very active in that organization since its inception in 1982. I am Canadian, I am Muslim, and I am a woman. So I'm always asked about my Canadian identity. I'm always asked by Muslims and non-Muslims about my Muslim identity. Oh, you don't look like a Muslim. Oh, when I see you, I don't see color. You're just like one of us. No, everybody sees my color. And in fact, I am a Muslim, but you may not know it. You know why? Because the identity of a Muslim woman is sort of preconceived now in our day and age by a woman who is dressed in a certain way, who is perhaps oppressed, subjugated, lacks agency, has no power. But we do. I do. I have my power, and I always use it. We each have our own power for the betterment of the world, and we use it. So all of those things that I described to you as being who I am, I'm asked about that all the time. And it's not coming from a malicious place. People are genuinely curious. But you have to think about it and say, okay, why does a brown person or a black person or a South Asian person, East Asian person, Southeast Asian person of African descent asked, where are you from? Even though they've been here for generations. They have lived here for hundreds of years. They're still asked, where are you from? And that is the ultimate question. That's what Lawrence says. That is the question that Canadians ask all the time. That's because Canadian identity is very complex. I don't think we're alone in the Western world, but it is a quintessentially Canadian question. And I think it's because we do want to know each other. In Islam, there's a verse that says, we have created you in nations and tribes so that you may know each other. And I think Kofi talked about that. How do we become a humanity? How do we make this a better place? How do we lose that individualism and obsession with winning and beating other people. It is really by getting to know one another. And the reason why I shared that information with you about myself was because I wanted you to know me. I wanted you to know who I am. I mean, you know some things about me now, but you know, each of us is a very complex individual. We do bring a lot of baggage with us, but most of the time that baggage is great. It's wonderful because it's carrying with us so many things that make us who we are and that we want to share with other people. We want to share with humanity, and we want to give. Because I do believe, and I believe that God gives us that gift to be giving. Because people don't want to take necessarily. They're willing to give. And, you know, in our faith tradition, giving is a very, very important part of practice. Giving alms is part of our practice. And fasting and feeding other people is part of our faith traditions. And actually an obligation in our faith. So we want to give and we want to share. And from, you know, and the other thing about our teachings is that we believe we were created from one soul. So we are all, in fact, from the same source, one soul. And the soul, as opposed to the physical being, is where our goodness and our humanity really resides, where we are able to give of ourselves. So I think we, you know, in going back to it, reflecting on what Kofi was saying about the fact that if you're inculcating in people individualism and always thinking about yourself, humanity, of course, will fail. And we've seen how it can fail by electing Mr. Trump. And we have to be really vigilant about this. We have to be conscious of the fact that we are human first, that we do need to get to know each other so that we do not demonize others. And by asking, you know, where are you really from? Yes, perhaps we just want to know. But unfortunately, we have to also think. We're, you know, the theme of rethinking identity. We do need to think about some people's motivation in wanting to know where you're really from, if you happen to be black or brown. One other thing that I was reflecting on is that, you know, for a very, very long time, I didn't know how to identify myself. You know, people would talk about, you know, black, white. Now I have a word for myself. It's brown. I can actually say I'm a brown person because that has emerged as an identity marker that actually did not exist in our lexicon. You know, in South Africa, people were called coloreds if they were not black or white. Here we often use the term visible minority or people of color. So we are evolving, and even though we're talking about coming together and creating our humanity together and bridging our existence, the fact is we are individuals. We do look different. Each person in this room does not look the same as the person sitting next to them. So we are all different, but we do come from one soul. So I find that very inspiring, that idea of coming from one soul. At least that is what we believe in our faith tradition. And we can get to know one another better, and we can make this world a place where really winning is not the be all and end all, but really the most important part of living is giving and learning from one another. And so I'm going to stop there, but I hope we have a chance to talk further.
Well, thank you, Nuzhat. Thank you so kindly for that. Your comments about being asked where you're from reminds me, my mother, if she was alive today, she'd be 125 years of age. I was an oops baby, born very late in her life. 125 years of age, but whenever she came to Canada or visited us in Singapore or other places that we were in, her normal curiosity would be, where are you from? And she would see somebody in India has a whole range of not colors, but of the hues, if you wish. And she said, and she would see somebody, black in let's say deep south. We went to Louisiana once. We took her there. She was with us, and she said, "Are you from Kerala?" Deep south in India. And she'd see somebody very white, and she said, "Are you from Kashmir?" With natural curiosity, but I think you pointed out well that it's the intent behind it, not the normal curiosity to find out where the person is, to know the person, as Kofi also said. The next speaker will have questions shortly afterwards. We have been given the dispensation to take an extra 10 minutes, but we'll still move on. Jonathan Hamilton-Diabo is from Khanna. Please forgive me if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Kanawake, Mohawk community located outside of Montreal. He is the Director, Indigenous Initiatives at the University of Toronto. After graduating from Concordia University, he moved to Toronto in 1993, making Scarborough his home. Working in the financial sector, he discovered his love for teaching, setting him on the path to get a Bachelor of Education. Jonathan has taught ESL to recent arrivals to Canada, coordinated the life skills and career programs at the Native Canadian Centre for Toronto, and taught at the Emmanuel College, Victoria University, nearby, and the Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, which now called the Martin Luther University College at Wilfrid Laurier University. In 2000, just as he was about to embark on a teaching career with TDSB, First Nation House, across the street, pried him away, therefore beginning an 18 years journey at the University of Toronto, in which 16 were spent at the First Nations House. There he had various roles: student, recruitment officer, academic and financial aid counselor, and director. Jonathan is a devoted Montreal Canadiens and Toronto Raptors. Yay! That's identities. A fan and knows way more about the superheroes than one would know. He has his great accomplishments as follows: co-chairing of the TRC Steering Committee at the University of Toronto, being the recipient of the Chancellor's Award for Emerging Leader, and most importantly, being with his wife, Patsy. Is she with us? And 3 young children who are his pride and joy. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Diabo.
Yeah, we'll go. Thank you. I wasn't sure which biography I'd send over this morning because I thought it was the one saying, raised by wild squirrels in Antarctica. So thankfully it wasn't that one. This was, and I'm following 2 very eloquent individuals here. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, what am I going to say? But I think they touched on so many different things that were very relevant to what I want to talk to you about today. I started looking at that question, what is it to be human? And I thought, it's too big, especially for 10 minutes. Started to think a little differently, is saying, how about we start with who am I? And I think when we start thinking about our place as a person, as a human being, is we have to really start reflecting upon who we are, our multiple identities, our multiple communities, the influences all around that. And I think it's really important to step back sometimes, take a breath and say, who am I really? Now, interesting, the question of where are you from is very different from an Indigenous standpoint. Because from our standpoint here, well, we ask this a lot in our own community. And the reason is what land are you from? Who are your people? Who do you identify with? Whether you're actually connected with them or not. Thank you very much, Nyawagua Miigwech Vern, for opening up and talking about really the need of relationships and that ability for us just to stand up and shake hands and to connect with one another. And that's what we try to find as we're saying, where are you from? I am from Kahnawake. It's a Mohawk community outside of Montreal. I grew up there. My family, in terms of my parents, my sisters, my nephews, my nieces, my friends, are all still there. I've been in Toronto since 1993. As mentioned, I have a very wonderful family. And I look at that on how just that alone has shaped who I am in terms of my influences of my own family, my influences of those who've taught me, my dudas, which in our nations, which are our grandparents, our knowledge keepers, our friends. There are so many different ways that as we go through life, help shape who we are. So mentioned, I've got multiple names, like Jonathan Hamilton-Diabo is quite a long name. I've got 3 middle names as well. One of my middle names is Degahomwazare, which is my Mohawk name. Now this, in our tradition, is a name given to you when you're born. Parents look through different names, they use different names. Now, how it's supposed to be in our community is that you're not supposed to have the name of someone who's alive. So if someone owns that name, they have it. You're not supposed to use it. My parents cheated. It was my grandfather, Degahomwazare Joe Macumber, who was also my godfather. And he had granted permission in that case to use his name. So growing up, all I knew it meant was turning canoe. Okay, that's a good name. Don't know what it means, but good name. Until I was younger, and he said to me, "You know where your name comes from?" I'm like, "No, I don't actually." You? Well, it turns out it was his grandfather's name. It was his name, now my name. But he said, it comes from the time when the Mohawks were on the Nile. You can imagine my thought process going on. There's a Nile in Quebec. There's a Nile in New York State. But I was too young to ask him that. And I wish I had that opportunity now as he has passed on to talk to more about it. However, as mentioned, I was in 2016, I believe, for a 1-week intensive course that I was teaching at, which is now, I believe, the Martin Luther University College, formerly known as Waterloo Lutheran Seminary. So I was teaching a course there for a 1 week in May. And so what I was doing was bringing my students throughout. They were meeting different people of community, and we were going, and because I worked at First Nations House at the same time, which is the Aboriginal Student Services, now Indigenous, we went through their counterparts. So I got to look at things. I went to the resource center. And as I was looking around, there is a book that's almost jumping out at me. It's called Mohawks on the Nile, written by Carl Benn, who's a historian at Ryerson University. So I can't tell you, I couldn't grab that book fast enough to look at that. And it is a story. It is a history of when the Mohawks were actually on the Nile River as part of a military expedition in the 1800s. The British Army had officers that were captured, and this was a rescue attempt. However, to get where they needed to go to, they had to travel down the river, and they didn't have the expertise to do so. So they looked to who did? Indigenous communities in this continent, because that's how we traveled. That was our highways, was the rivers, and they needed people who could navigate that. And there were roughly about 100 Indigenous people who were part of that large expedition. Unfortunately, failed, I guess, but it was still part of history. And a lot of those community members were from Kahnawake. Most of them would have been Mohawk, but there were folks that were also Ojibwe as well, or Anishinaabe. And so that's my name. That's part of who I am. That is part of my community's history and that story. And that helped me grow in so many different ways that I never thought about, was that we don't take who we are for granted as people, as identity. I think there are so many different things about myself that I've learned. But what it taught me was that sometimes the person across from me, who I'm speaking to, also has a story. of where they come from, who they are. And we forget that now. We sometimes get too caught up in our life. We get too caught up in expectations. We get too caught up in making judgments about the other person in front of us because of what they say, how they say things, how they look, what we perceive them to be. I grew up through life for people shocking them when I'm saying I'm Mohawk, because they have a different image of what that means to be an Indigenous person. They have a whole different idea of Indigenous people. Wait a second, aren't they mostly homeless and drunks? Or up north? Or dark skin, long hair? No. We are different. We look different. We don't all think the same. And that is something that I've taken upon, that every opportunity I have is to help people understand that. And that's just not within Indigenous communities. As mentioned, there are other faith communities as well that have that stigma that's attached to them the minute if they say they're Muslim. They say that there's something different. Suddenly they become the other. And they're no longer seen as people at that connection point. I throw people off when I say I'm Christian. I was raised Catholic. I was married in a Baptist church. I went to United Church. Went back to Baptist. I've taught in a Lutheran seminary. I've taught in United Church. My sisters practice the Longhouse tradition. We are complex. There is nothing straightforward about who we are. But where it comes down to is our story. And how do we share that with one another? How do we learn who we are? And how do I learn who you are? Because we are not going to grow together unless we discover each other's truth, each other's histories, and we respect that. We are going to have differences of opinions. We are going to see the world in different ways. But that's okay. We are now in a society that no longer has that space anymore to do it. We're in a space where it's instant reaction to when someone says something that's different from you. Condemnation, judgment. You're wrong. We've lost that ability to even reach out to understand each other, to have a dialogue. We cannot have a talk anymore, to try to present each other's point of views to each other. However, we may not change our minds at the end, but that's actually how we go at it. I'm going to talk at you. I'm going to change your mind. Why? Because I'm right. You're wrong. That's our world. And we need to step back from that and understand that everyone has a different point of view, a different way of thinking, a different history. It's because it's their experiences that shape them. And we have to give that space for those stories to come out. Because things will change. But it won't be just the other person. I will change too. And that is an important piece of what it means to be human. It's to understand that we all have different communities that we go into. We have different identities, and we need to respect that. And we need to respect ourselves and understand who we are. But don't be so rigid to that point that we have shut everyone else out who do not think like us or we perceive are not like us. So In closing, I'd just like to say a quote by C.S. Lewis. I'm going to tweak it a little bit because he uses the word man. I'm going to talk about people. Friendship is born when one person says to another, "What? You too? I thought no one but myself." We need to be open. We need to talk about who we are, share our experiences, share what we know, share our gifts. And that's how we can grow together. Now we'll go on.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have only about 4 minutes, so we may not have the luxury of asking a question among the panelists. However, there's one twin objective of this conference, which was very well articulated, which I don't think we've had a chance to talk about. I'll just make my personal observation on that, and that is about bridging the religious secular divide in a national public discourse. Someone like me from my background has a bit of a difficulty with that, in that 1/3 of the human population thinks of the secular religious divide differently. Mahatma Gandhi was passionate about being a secular, even as he was one of the most religiously committed person. So in that 1/3 of the population, secularism, religions are not opposing views, but are complementary. Secularism in that context means not favoring any one particular religion. To respect all, to draw strength from all. Mahatma Gandhi drew strength from every religion, from Popol Vuh to the Bible, to the Beatitudes, to the Sermon on the Mount, to the Quran, to the Dhampada, etc., etc. And therefore, he was also a very secular person, deeply committed to. There's no contradiction. However, with another 2 days. In conclusion, I think we have Honorable Bob Ray sitting here joining us for a few minutes. We don't want to take too much of time. But in studying the history of mankind, the developments of political and economic forces have predominantly been emphasized, with religion often seen as an adjunct. This methodology has led us to see, at times, the alliances between the custodians of our faith traditions and those economic and political powers of the day. Jihads, crusades, inquisitions, to this day, maybe lesser so. The Buddhist generals in Burma, wink, wink, nod, nod, the atrocities committed against the Rohingyas. In my own land of my ancestors, the present government nodding here and there to the emboldenment of the Hindutva crusaders against anyone who eats meat, beef. And the list goes on and on and on and on. These diabolical, forceful identities, and we'll have lots of occasions the next 2 days, until tomorrow evening. But the one sentence that sums it all, I guess, is that in the context of terrorism that you referred to, and we've been speaking last night, it has been suggested that those who commit terror, these are, by the way, they're the perpetrators. They are not the forces behind. The forces are the economic, political forces who have terrorized these young people's minds to believe that their particular view of a one set belief system is the only one. And they are terrorized. All bullies are cowards. All terrorists are terrorized in their own minds to think that the rest of us are against them, which is not the case. We are the majority. And we thank you.